Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third Monday. I'm Joel Fishman, President of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. It is my privilege, on behalf of the University of Southern California Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, and the PDCA to welcome you to the third Monday, November 2024. Globally, this has been a season of national elections, 64 in 2024 alone. Many of these have been characterized by dramatic upheaval, including our own here in the U.S. this month. Our panel today will explore this trend, how the U.S. election fits into this trend, and what it may imply for public diplomacy. Our moderator today is Adam Powell, Director of the USC Annenberg Center of Washington Programs, and a former president of PDCA's predecessor organization, the Public Diplomacy Council. Today's tech host is PDCA Comstock Fellow Gabby Stahl. To make Gabby's life easier, please, for those of you participating online, please remember to put your questions, your substantive questions in the Q&A box and technical questions in the chat box. This program was conceived and planned by PDCA's program co-chair, Gordon Duguid, well before we knew the outcome of the U.S. election. We could not be addressing a more fitting topic right now. So, with his prescience intact, I now turn the program over to Gordon.
Thank you, Joel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Joel mentioned that this is a banner year for elections around the world, and it is heartening to see that elections are being held in more countries. But the results of those elections, of course, depend very much on local conditions. However, are there trends that we can spot in these elections, and what can we learn as public diplomacy practitioners from those trends? Our speakers are here to help us work through that question. Today, we have with us Ms. Joyce Karam, who is a senior editor at AI Monitoring and a journalist with decades of experience covering the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, and international affairs. She authors AI Monitor's weekly China Middle East briefing newsletter and serves as a professor of political science at George Washington University. Mr. Schafer is a senior fellow in media and digital disinformation for the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. He is also the creator and manager of Hamilton 2.0, an online open source dashboard tracking the outputs of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian state media outlets, diplomats, and government officials. As President Fishman noted, our moderator is Mr. Adam Schafer today, and to him, I hand over the floor.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you online for those who are joining by Zoom. We will have remarks from the two speakers, and we'll go to Q&A here, as well as Q&A online. We'll go in alphabetical order. So if we can begin with speakers online.
Great, thank you. I am my first threat would win on alphabetical order, but great to be here. They told me to project my voice, which is, if you know anybody from the Middle East, it's not a problem at all. So thank you, Gordon. Thanks, Adam. Great to be here. Very timely event. But I'm going to limit my remarks to the elections in the Middle East. We can discuss, of course, how what we've seen over the last year would impact U.S. policy. But to start with, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Lebanon during the war, so we didn't have much elections at the time. We have had elections recently, but I think democratic would not fit the word. The country is in complete dysfunction. Those elections were 2 years ago, so I'm not gonna talk about them much. But I've been covering U.S. policy and the Middle East since 2004. And going through several administrations. I remember in 2004, at the height of the Iraq War, there was the push for changing hearts and minds in the Middle East, democratizing the region, parallels to Eastern Europe, a new wave happening in the Middle East. Sadly, the Iraq War did not meet these aspirations. Then 2011 came with the Arab Spring, and everybody saying, Washington, Tunisia, populist dictator, then Egypt, President Mubarak. There was another push, momentum, hope in Washington that maybe that will finally tip the scales in the Middle East for democracy. I'm sure, as you all follow and as you would all perhaps conclude, this hasn't happened either. So when we look at the region and when we look in the last year, and I'm going to count Egypt elections because they happened in December 2023, I think Abdel Fattah al-Sisi would be very pleased that we mentioned him as a winner of those elections. But we've seen elections in Egypt, we've seen elections in Algeria, we've seen elections in Turkey, we've seen elections in Iran and in Tunisia. With the exception of Turkey, it is fair to say that the larger picture is undemocratic elections, where figures such as Sisi in Egypt, such as Qais Said in Tunisia, such as Tafouni in Algeria, won by over 90%. Even as somebody, I'm sure many of you probably travel to the region, if you talk to people, there is no way 90% are happy with the political system or the economic conditions that are in place in the region. But in Turkey, it was the first time we see those elections go for a second round of voting. And that surprised many because Recep Tayyip Erdogan is still very much here, at least. He's seen as an authoritarian figure, but that was not exactly the case. The opposition made headwinds in that election. And what we're seeing today in Turkey is more of an inclusive form of for AKP to be doing politics after those elections. So we're seeing Erdogan extend his hand to the Kurdish alliance to try to make peace through them. We'll see where that goes. We're seeing also Erdogan, unlike the last 10 years, he's trying to reconcile with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So that's the Turkey. In Kuwait, we've seen legislative elections where actually the opposition won those elections. But when you look at the top, the new emir in Kuwait is seen as much more leaning heavily on just silencing the opposition, expanding his powers, cracking down on Islamist parties. So Kuwait is very much moving also to the Arab Gulf fold in that sense. When you look at Israel is the big question mark because everybody is saying maybe we will see, maybe the government will actually collapse from within and we will see upcoming elections. That hasn't happened. Benjamin Netanyahu is very much masterfully played the Knesset politics and has a coalition in place that will probably, unless we see something different with his trial in December, that could last till 2026 when his term is over. So that's another area where, you know, Washington hopes do not materialize events. Palestinian elections, that's another very unfortunate story. I'm really sorry, I have no good news to tell you this. But despite push after push for Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to hold elections, there has been no elections in over a decade. Now with Gaza is in a, I don't want to even say state of war, it's beyond. It's a state of utter devastation. So we don't know what will happen to Gaza itself. I don't know how will the Palestinian politics emerge from the Gaza war. That's still an open question. But the war itself has helped Sisi in Egypt conclude his election successfully, maintain power. Before the Gaza war, there was more discussion about economy, inflation in Egypt, you know, price of gas, bread, and all of that. But immediately after the war, you've seen a shift in the narrative in the region that has very much helped these frontmen, if we will, maintain their power. When you look at across the region generally, and I'm just going to mention the US election just briefly, many are pleased with the outcome because it appeals to their priorities. It's not, or at least it doesn't look like an administration that will push them on the question of reforms, of democracy, of holding elections. And that's very welcome news. As the author of the, you know, I'll monitor China's newsletter, I can tell you many look at China as a shining model and not the one that the Bush administration tried to push in 2004. So this is my pessimistic, or as Gordon likes to call it, realistic picture from the Middle East. I'm looking forward to our discussion and back and forth over, any questions you might have.
Thank you, Joyce. Bret, over to you.
Thank you. So I usually don't have any problem projecting my voice, but it was my 20-year college reunion over the weekend. And surprisingly, I can't cheer through a football game in my 40s the way I could in my 20s. So I'll try to be relatively brief here. So besides my main job at the Alliance for Security and Democracy, which a lot of what we do is trying to track, monitor, and then expose what Russia, China, and Iran are doing in info space, I'm also the co-chair of the External Action Service of the EU's, what they call the FINI ISAC. It's just a really terrible acronym, but it's Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And what that is, it's their attempt to get the research community to all start actually talking to one another, but using the same taxonomies and also using the same platforms so that when we find an operation and our partners at Atlantic Council find the same thing, we're actually connecting dots. So it's a very different approach that they're sort of going with in the EU compared to what we're seeing in the US, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So we're now at the tail end of what was dubbed the year of the elections, right? Where half the world's population are going to vote. Many of the countries that were holding elections, some of which were actually not predicted at the beginning of the year, are places that Russia in particular cares deeply about. So we have been able to witness in real time an evolution in tactics in terms of the foreign information manipulation landscape. So we've had elections in Moldova, in Georgia, in the UK, in France, the EU, the US. So we've sort of seen what Russia has in store, how it shifted from 2016, but I'll start the remarks with a note of caution. We don't know what we don't know. It took us until 2018 to get a pretty good sense of what Russia did in the 2016 elections. So in the next couple of weeks, you'll see a lot of after action reports and suggestions that we now have a better sense of our foreign adversaries and what they're doing around elections, I would approach all those with a significant amount of skepticism. It's too early. Also, we have limited visibility as researchers into what's happening in the info space. We can track the overt and we can track platforms that are open. Those have actually started closing down. So even the work that we could do in 2020 has become more difficult. So you look at the tech platforms, Meta and Twitter, now X, they have made it harder for researchers to access data. They've taken down APIs. It's just far more difficult for us to get a sense of what Russia, China, Iran are even doing in the spaces that we can monitor, let alone what they might be doing on encrypted channels. And we also used to have to track 3 major platforms. Now we've got to track 30 or 40. There's been sort of a balkanization of the digital information landscape. Some of these platforms have been built up around the idea of any sort of moderation is censorship. So there's free reign for them to work there, and they do not want to collaborate or be seen to collaborate with the research community. So there's a significant amount that we just don't know. So those caveats aside, I'm going to focus my remarks, broadly speaking, on the tactics and techniques we've seen across the transatlantic space, rather than focusing on each individual election, just because it would get unwieldy and we don't have enough time. And then also a little bit on the differences between the US and the EU response to foreign information manipulation. But I actually will start in somewhat of a chronological order and focus on one election. So Slovakia was one of the first elections out of the gate this year. Again, a country that Russia cares deeply about. You had sort of a pro-Russian, more pro-EU candidate for the presidential election, but also in the parliamentary elections, you had a clear split there. And what we saw 2 days before the Slovakian election, there was a release of a piece of synthetic audio, a deep fake, that purported to have one candidate saying that they were going to rig the election. It also had the candidate saying they were going to raise the price of beer, which, you know, the Slovaks was probably a bigger issue for him. Unclear the threat actor who created this and disseminated it. Unclear the impact it had. We always don't really know. But this was 2 days before the election. It was a razor tight margin. The pro-EU candidate lost. So that set the stage for this prediction that this would be the year that AI and deepfakes would upend democracy. And so much of the focus this year is on AI and elections. We do a lot of work with state and local election officials in the US. Task force were set up around AI. What are the AI threats? Putting aside my earlier warning that we don't know what we don't know, I can pretty confidently say that AI didn't revolutionize what we saw in the information space targeting elections this year. There were isolated incidents for sure, but most of what we saw in the US coming from foreign and domestic is the same stuff we've seen for a decade. So the Foreign Malign Influence Center, which if you're not familiar with them, it's really, I guess they became operational in 2022. So this was their first major election working out of ODNI. Their assessment was that AI helped to improve and accelerate foreign information manipulation. It didn't revolutionize it. But what it helped Russia, China, Iran with is it helped them scale their operations. They could put out more content. They could do it faster. Language was much better. But going back to 2016, you could spot the Russian bot and the Russian troll because they had issues with articles in English. That's gone. And so it's allowed them to more precisely target. But what we didn't see was this deep fake that everybody was fearful of that would somehow flip people's perceptions of a candidate. My concern always was we would see a deep fake after the election in this period right now to create conflict around the integrity of the vote. I think if Russia had a play, that was their play. So they might just not have rolled it out, given the election results, given the margins, they might back pocket it. But we just didn't see it materialize this time around. In the FMF space, though, we did see some tactical shifts from what we've seen in the past. Going back to 2016, we saw the Russians attempt to carpet bomb the information space. Hundreds of thousands of fake accounts, bots, and trolls presenting themselves as real Americans, flooding the zone across information platforms. That started to shift in 2020. The way Facebook sort of presented it is they've moved from wholesale to retail. They're sort of more specifically targeting issues, candidates, individuals. I think we've seen that grow actually in the last 4 years. I think they understand, one, it is more difficult to run a network of hundreds of thousands of fake accounts and not have them be caught, even though the tech platforms have drawn back on some of their content moderation. That stuff will be caught. Two, it's not all that effective. It's hard to carry out this entire artifice around fake accounts. Easier to leverage real people, real outlets. So that was one of the big things that we saw both in the US and overseas, is the attempt to co-opt individuals or platforms who were authentic Americans or sort of genuine outlet overseas. We first saw this in the Czech Republic. There was a site called Voice of Europe. It's confused with Voice of America. So Voice of Europe is something we actually tracked for years because we saw pro-Russian accounts boosting it. It used to be an anti-immigration site, very, very hard right, but it was run by 3 Dutch guys because we did a little investigative work. Some were like baggage handlers at Schiphol Airport, but always had this weird connection in sort of pro-Russian communities. At some point, it was overtaken by a pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarch, and they started using this platform to try to bribe far-right officials across the EU, while also sort of mirroring that with information operations. So the Czechs took down Voice of Europe in March, and that gave us a little bit of a heads up that we might see something similar here, the attempt to sort of co-opt an authentic American news outlet. In September, DOJ unsealed an indictment for this company called Tenant Media. Tenant Media is a Tennessee-based company, was a Tennessee-based company that had hired 6 of the more influential podcasters, influencers on the political right. I mean, these are people who have million-plus followings across platforms going back years. And they had pumped, when I say they, the Russians had pumped $10 million into this platform. These podcasters were making upwards of $100,000 a video for it. They were unwitting, according to the indictment. So they did not know that this was a Russian government-funded platform. But what it did was it brought a massive audience to a platform the Russians controlled. And so what we saw in the indictment, at moments where Russia wanted to change the conversation, they then had an authentic platform where they could shift the narrative. So after the terrorist attacks in Moscow, they wanted to inject this idea that there was a US-Ukrainian intelligence operation behind it. Obviously, the US intelligence community had said this was ISIS. And they used this platform to try to push this out into the American ecosystem. So we don't know what they had in store for the US election for this platform because it was taken down in September, but that was the concern. They had a platform at their disposal at any given time. They could have shifted in a different direction. Other challenge for Russia this time around, which led to a change in tactics, is they couldn't use their overt outlets in the same way. The US has not banned RT, Sputnik. The EU has, but most platforms have taken action against them. Meta actually did take down RT in September because of Russian intelligence-linked operations that were being run through their pages. But anyway, far more difficult for the Russians to influence Americans and Europeans through their official state media outlets. So we saw them do 2 different things this time around. One is this thing we call information laundering. This idea of getting Russian information laundered through other outlets so that viewers have no idea where it's coming from. But it's not just the viewers, the audience, it's also the platforms. Platforms will ban the actual Russian domain. What they will not ban is content created by that Russian domain, laundered and published on another site. So we did some work, I guess it was in May, we released this report that we actually talked about the last time I was here. Our information laundering report, just looking at RT's English language outlet, we found 400 websites that were republishing in whole or in part Russian state media content that were showing up in search results that were able to sort of bypass the EU's restrictions. So these were sites like Man Stuff News, which is pretty much what it sounds. It's grilling, it's off-road vehicles, it's sports. The entirety of their international section is verbatim from Russian state media. We saw it on spirituality sites, yoga sites, for example. We saw it on all of these faux local news sites. So a site like Chicago Chronicle, just running RT content. This was also used through this campaign called Copy Cop. So Copy Cop is named because there's a guy named John Mark Dugan, former Florida cop, now lives in Moscow, has intelligence links, runs a network of fake local sites in the US. He's also the guy who appeared in a Rumble's a YouTube alternative video where he claimed to have evidence of then Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz molesting children at the school where he used to teach. So he's been very much sort of central to a lot of disinfo campaigns. So all of these different ways of sort of bypassing, circumventing restrictions, but also getting Russian content and outlets that do not have any clear indication that they are connected to the Russian government. One of the things you may have also heard about is this campaign called Doppelganger, creating sites that look identical to news sites that you would go to, but there's a little bit of a typo in the domain. So instead of WashingtonPost.com, I think it was WashingtonPost.jp. But the masthead looks identical, able to inject pro-Russian commentary, where most people who are scrolling through their news feeds on social media are not going to notice this typo. It's a trick called typo squatting. It's what a lot of scammers do too. You think you're going to Amazon, you put in one letter incorrectly, you get redirected. They've started using that as a tactic to get people to land on sites that look authentic, trustworthy, but are entirely sort of owned, operated, manipulated by foreign actors. The Iranians do this too. And so the final sort of piece of evidence I wanted to touch on of this sort of clear shift in thinking of information operations is using fake accounts, fake websites, as opposed to using real Americans or real Europeans to get your information out there. We know that the Iranians hacked the Trump campaign. They also penetrated the Harris campaign. That may have been more for espionage than info ops. But they had exfiltrated information from the Trump campaign instead of, like the Russians did in 2016, creating a fake social media account and blogs to publish it. They just went to authentic US outlets and tried to get it published there. Now, to the credit of most of those outlets like Politico, they didn't run with it. I mean, they eventually found a few reporters who did publish these leaks, but it clearly shows that they understand that that's our weakness too. We are quite comfortable at the government level, at the platforms, taking down content if it is clearly attributed to a foreign source. Once it is published by a domestic outlet or individual, our hands are a bit tied, particularly after the Hunter Biden laptop. They're watching us, they understand this as a clear weakness, especially after the weaponization of the government investigations over the last year. So that's what we saw them do this time. Look for the individuals who might benefit, try to launder it through that period. Oh, final thing, I definitely wanted to mention, we saw in Moldova, made its way here 2 days later with the bomb threats. Note of caution, we do not yet know whether or not the Russian government were involved in these bomb threats, but what we saw in Moldova, where attribution seemed a little bit clearer, the day of the election, bomb threats were phoned in to many embassies outside of Moldova, as well as some polling places in Moldova, where it was presumed there would be a more pro-EU vote. So this happened in Germany, it happened in the UK, it happened in parts of Moldova. German government, Moldovan government have said for sure this is the Russian government. So we had a little bit of warning that we might see efforts here to suppress the vote, with bomb threats, with swatting incidents. And we did see, I forget the final number now, but I think 38 different precincts were targeted with fake bomb threats on election day. My understanding is it didn't significantly disrupt operations. They were really well prepared for it. We did some wargaming with Arizona's Secretary of State looking at this exact possibility, but they would have to close it for 10, 15 minutes to do a sweep, which presumably somebody who came to vote didn't vote because of this. So that's a real concern going forward. Again, we don't know if this is the Russian government, but this is out in the wild as a technique that can be used in elections to suppress the vote, get a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more widespread. So I've gone on probably too long. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on the sort of divergences in the responses from the US and the EU, because I think this might be an important or significant point of conflict going forward. The EU's approach has very much been to support the research community and to put pressure on the platforms to take content down if there's any indication that there's a foreign malign influence effort. The US approach has been more of a law enforcement approach, create cases, unseal indictments, and I will give the intelligence community a lot of credit. I think the Foreign Malign Influence Center was great this time at declassifying things and getting it out to the public quickly. But it's a more of an official government response. They are not working with the platforms to take down content. And in fact, the US government, especially with the new administration, I think will be very hostile to EU efforts to try to sanitize the information space from foreign and domestic threats. We've already seen the weaponization committee come out quite strongly against Europe's Digital Services Act and label it a tsunami of censorship coming to America. So in terms of PD responses, I expect there to be a lot of friction with the Trump administration and the EU over the next couple of years in terms of how we respond to election threats. And I'll stop there just because I've gone.
I was going to jump and say that I have the first question. I was recently in touch on the weekend with some folks who've been watching the African elections. In the country, and South Africa being a main one, but also most recently in Mauritius, where the opposition, Alliance de Changement, won all but one of the country's 21 constituents. And they completely threw the ruling party out of the parliament. And I asked the question, what are the issues that voters are looking at, both from my contacts in South Africa and Mauritius? I don't want to overgeneralize the entire continent, but they said that the issues were the cost of living and corruption. Thankfully, it was that in South Africa. There's also crime and violence, but as you are looking at the election, what are the voters, whether or not they feel they have a choice, a real choice, but what are the voters looking at as far as what the issues are that they want to set by the government?
I'll start. I think that, there is definitely, you can see a pattern in countries where there's no conflict, where there is some Russian interference, that, issues related to inflation or cost of living or corruption increasingly determining those elections, the results. But at the same time, you see in the African continent, and just full transparency, I don't follow Africa that closely, but there is enough evidence that France, even the US, are on the back foot. And you're seeing a bigger push from Russia, definitely from China when it comes to economics, but there's been a couple of developments in Mali, I think, for the war that played to Russia's advantage. So this would definitely be one to watch the coming year. As for the Middle East, I wish it was the cost of living. It's you wake up with the news, Yemen is in a state of war. Israel is bombing Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, on occasion, Yemen. So the narrative is definitely one of stability and how we can wake up, get out of our houses, go to our jobs without being under the risk of bombardment. So the whole equation of, stability and we can hold elections has been disrupted since the Gaza war, and it's a turning point in the region that's very much to the works. Even with the elections in Iran that we saw, those were also happened because of a crisis, because of the president died in a crash, the foreign minister died as well. So it's the situation that we're seeing now in the Middle East is very much one of uncertainty, one of much volatility, where inflation, cost of living, where they might be priorities in let's say Saudi Arabia or countries that don't have regular elections, they're not in countries under conflict.
And then putting on sort of my PD cap, because I am a USC PD alum, even though it's not sort of central to my work now. I think the narrative that has not worked well overseas or domestically was the focus on democracy as the thing unto itself. And so I've had many conversations with colleagues throughout the, the so-called global South, how much they kind of resent that framing in us, that we're forced to choose between the democratic West and authoritarians. This sort of democracy versus autocracy just is not resonating, because they're saying, one, we've had at times an element of democracy, it didn't work for us. Not that we, as sort of elites in the room, don't believe in it, but you got to deliver for people. And so we're at more basic, human needs here. And so coming at it from up here and saying we should reject the better offer from China because of this autocracy versus democracy doesn't work. I don't think it worked as a campaign issue in the US particularly well, honestly. I mean, you look at democracy actually was, according to exit polls, the top of people's list of things they cared about in this election. But it was evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And I think the GOP kind of effectively changed that narrative around censorship and the idea we can't even have normal conversations anymore. And so that is the one thing that I think, believe me, I'm not saying that Russia is responsible for this at all here, but they're very good at exploiting that. Russia has somehow positioned themselves as an anti-censorship regime through its state media, which, I mean, the irony, of course, is very rich, but that is how RT projects itself, is we are an alternative to the sort of sanitized Western perspective. And so I think we need to get a better message to counter that.
I would add one, actually, just more to that. In the Middle East, when you look at, let's say somebody sitting in Doha, right, watching what's happening, there is a credibility crisis for the West.
Yeah.
Not just the US, also the European countries, looking at what happened in Ukraine and the outrage and everything. And they look, when Gaza came about, it's not just radio silence. They actually may appreciate radio silence more than what they're hearing from or what they've heard over the last year from the Biden administration. It's shocking. It's a degree of a gap between audiences and public that I haven't seen before in my reporting on the region. They see a double standard. They see that Middle Eastern lives, Muslim lives don't matter. A president can go on TV and proclaim that he is a Zionist. And those are things that are jarring for Arab and Muslim audiences. Within that credibility crisis, you're seeing China take to like that. So Russia is a little bit, I think I agree with you, Bret, that RT does not do great. It did, let's say, a decade ago in the Middle East. I'm not sure why is that, but it's not as popular as it used to be. Al Jazeera is back as primary source of information, and Arabiya a little bit. But I mean, China, if you look poll after poll, their credibility is going up. They've struck a tone on the Gaza conflict that's more resonates better with the general public. So this is one to look for. Of course, I mean, U.S. Funded media is. I mean, I don't know where you can find it in the region. It used to be it's popular with pop music, radio however, that's no longer the case. Even so, it's Disney. It's not making any impact. And I think that public diplomacy hold that this administration is departing with is pretty deep and real in the region.
If you look at Russia, China, Iran, where their narratives intersect. It is double standards hypocrisy. Not new, but it has definitely found a home in the last year.
A question, and then we'll definitely get to the audience. I see one hand already. USC has, since 2015, had a cybersecurity initiative, and elections now, actually next week, we're going to expand to our fourth continent, Australia, at the invitation of the Home Affairs Ministry. And what we find, last month we were in Cyprus, coming up with in Germany, sort of places. What we find is that, to your point, there's not a lot of information sharing going on. And this reason that the Australian Home Affairs Ministry said, you've got to do a program here. That, I shared some information that we had from British intelligence on how to handle phone calls and see fake video. And me and her foreman, as her cyber people, we need to know things like this. Well, Judy and I had some meetings preparing another, large Asian country for another country, and spent 2 hours at their foreign affairs ministry. And the minister said, cyber securing democracy and public diplomacy. To agree, and if so, this is a public diplomacy council, some suggestions.
Well, the information sharing is a problem for sure. I think a lot of the focus over the last 8 years has been how can we work more closely with the tech platforms to make sure that when we see things, we get it taken down. And Elon's taking over of X has kind of blown that up. And so talking to another Aussie colleague from a department I won't name, who was saying, we used to at least have a channel into X to say, we are seeing something that is particularly concerning. We would get a response. It's like there's one person in Singapore who covers the entire region now. We don't even get a response from them. So hopefully that will have them shift more towards a better information sharing among allies there, although I think there may be some concerns, frankly, going forward. But I agree with you, broadly speaking, there are lessons we can learn from elections in the cybersecurity space that need to be communicated out. I think our election officials did a particularly good job this time around. Again, partly because they recognized in 2022, we're not going to have the platform save us. That was their approach. How we filter stuff to the platform to get it taken down. They realized they needed to be the frontline messenger. So people like Adrian Fontes in Arizona built an AI and election task force with people like us and communications professionals, and they communicated among themselves much better. So I think if we look at the US model where we did a good job this time around, again with the bomb threats, because they were ready for that. And they had tabletop exercises. And they also did some things tangibly, like, this is public knowledge, so I can talk about it, but they were concerned about swatting incidents targeting election officials. So they gave local law enforcement all of their addresses. So when they would get a call in saying, hey, there's a guy with a gun at 312 Main Street, they would know that is the Arizona Secretary of State and not to show up guns drawn. So I think we just need to look at the information sharing that happened in the US among secretaries of state, local election officials, and the research community. Because we worked with the Brennan Center, we had calls every other week for 6 months with state and local officials to talk about the information landscape. We just now need to export that, I think, to some other places.
In one of our first state meetings, we did all 50 states in 2020. One of our first state meetings in 2018 was in Richmond, Virginia. And the Commonwealth of Virginia insisted on having their Department of Transportation as part of that session. Because you need to know where roads are in construction, you need to know what might be very interesting. And Carl, I think that's for sure.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Carl Schultz, until recently with the Global Engagement Center, the GEC. Very closely, that's a lot of the projects. Happily retired now. So I can be more provocative than I could a few months ago. And I'm focusing this on elections. So I'm not looking at the past ones, I'm looking at future ones coming forward. We have not finished the efforts of the two outlined to try to create a more close-knit international coalition to fight TB and upgrade our efforts to tackle these questions publicly as well as privately. Our team's put McCabe down was a major effort, and we're happy to see the results of it. But the Russians and other countries know that we have domestic laws constraining our ability to do anything domestically. They take advantage of that and exploit it. And their first information leaks out now through those fake domestic websites or through American individuals. Even if he's co-opted by them, which they know that makes them untouchable. It's ironic that PRC, Iran, and Russia and other countries that have somehow managed to, in the global discussion, presented themselves as the champion of personal freedom and civil liberty and fighting Western censorship. But we all know it's the other way around, that we're not effective at conveying that to same audiences. My question is, we're going forward now with more elections around the world. But in the United States, in recent days, we've seen appointments of people like Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Matt Gaetz, and others. So what are we going to do to protect the hen houses now with Fox is in charge?
I will say some of the appointments, I'm going to be as diplomatic as possible here, are going to complicate our efforts to work with USG. And it's not out of the realm of the possible, certainly, that we will see an increase in attacks on us as a research community coming from within our government, as opposed to from without. Because it's something we've certainly dealt with over the last 2 years to a degree, but it's possible that we'll see an escalation there. I don't know how to get around that other than to say, I think there will be real concern. I know the European partners have asked about sharing information with us if all of those go through. And I don't know what to do about that other than just to flag that EU officials are concerned, and they have already noted that from Five Eyes to research collaborations that they would hesitate to work closer with us.
I don't think it's much of an issue in the Middle East, obviously, because we're not at democracy yet, so we're not in. I mean, there is disinformation more so in Arabic on Twitter that goes, unchecked. For the appointments themselves, if you look at the cabinet or generally the pattern that's emerging, it's very much a pro-Israel cabinet, perhaps more than if they all get affirmed, even more than the W. Bush era. And names, Mike Huckabee, ambassador to Israel, others. I don't know how this would alleviate the credibility crisis that's taking place with Trump. Leaders in the region view him as transactional. They like doing business with him. They're more likely to get their weapons, to get their, their contracts than with another administration. So the focus will probably be shifting on that. And hard to predict the Gaza situation.
I will say it's just the last note. I think we needed to do a better job for a while, and definitely need to do a better job now of leaning directly into the concerns among some on the right that come from a place of good faith. And I think for a while those were sort of dismissed, but that opened up an area for the discussion around the kind of work we do to really be framed on their terms. And by there, I mean, the sort of Twitter leaks kind of people of we're for an open internet and we're against censorship and we're all adults here. And Americans should be able to make the choices they want to make about what they see. And all of these other people, because we're all sort of looped together in the censorship industrial complex, as they call it, are for this sort of pro-NATO sanitized version of things, and these people want to keep information from you. It's a very winning argument over here. It's, I would say, a sort of mythical version of the internet that it created because it suggests that this is like the Lincoln Douglas debates. I mean, you just have two sites who have competing points of view, and they both get their fair share of time. It's not how algorithms work. And so somebody is making a determination about what to show at the top of your feed, including things if you're Googling at 3 a.m, my child is having trouble breathing, what do I do? And if you want to live in a place where we're ranking credible health sites the same as totally fringy conspiracy sites, and it might tell you should bathe your kid in acid, fine. But like, right, let's actually have a conversation about what we're comfortable with. But I do think we need to start having those conversations more with, again, good faith individuals on the right and not dismissing their concerns around censorship, because that has created this dynamic that's gotten us into a pretty bad spot.
If I may, for public diplomacy practitioners, it has always been their job to show that the United States is a diverse nation with hundreds of thousands of different points of view. And it should be the job in every administration to show all sides of any question. This may help us address the charges of hypocrisy, but it should be on the top of the next Secretary of State and the next Secretary of Public Diplomacy to put forward as broad a set of representations of U.S. opinion as possible.
John, excuse me.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for being here. I have a two-parter. First on the Middle East, maybe Joyce can weigh in most. So many of us are reading the reports. The Ayatollah is near death now. Frankly, I'm the same person who speculated what would happen when Putin was gone. And frankly, I thought the Pope was going to die 2 years ago. They're still around. And so I'm not guessing post-Ayatollah. But were he to pass, would a more moderate figure come in, and would the elected officials assert themselves at this point and try to show some authority against the theocracy?
Yeah, great question, John. Great to see you too. So I've seen these reports, but there was a video of him released yesterday, meeting the former Iranian ambassador in Lebanon who got wounded in the pager attack. So, for this moment, the reports about his death or his coma are seem a bit exaggerated. Doesn't mean that what's happening in Iran is its best days. It's not. The country is under a lot of economic pressure. It's under plenty of outside pressure. Its proxies are fighting wars in Lebanon and in Syria. It lost, as we've mentioned, the president, the foreign minister in the last year. So when you look at the landscape, it's not one that favors the regime at the moment. However, the names that, if Khamenei were to pass, I would say his son Mujtaba is the most likely closest to succeed him. And yeah, again, not great news, but he's more hardline than Khamenei. It would likely bring a more consolidated IRGC power. We'll see what's going to happen with the nuclear program. Some are talking about, if Israel would strike between now and inauguration day, or if it would wait and, get a deal, a bargain with Trump, give him something with Saudi and then strike Iran. So A lot of unanswered questions there, but definitely the situation in Iran is one to watch very closely.
My other. Thank you. My other question, it focuses more on the West. We're going to have elections in Germany sooner than we expected, probably February. I read this morning. And Canada, the Trudeau government is likely to go down sometime before the end of next year, which means two important Western democracies will have all important elections. And in both cases, candidates who are more nationalist, populist slash, are right now the betting favorites. Friedrich Merz, its CDU, and Pierre Poilievre of the Conservative Party in Canada. Do you see these places as harbingers of AI election interference and the things that you discussed earlier?
Well, beyond a more nationalist, if it is the sort of CDU that comes out on top, I talked to German journalists last week who think AfD will be number two. And so if you're looking at coalition building, the Germans usually have to do how you cobble that together, I think is going to be very interesting going forward. So Germany will certainly take a rightward shift, whether it's a more traditional CDU rightward shift or some sort of constellation of, and I forget the name of the new party now that is ostensibly on the left.
FGP.
It's one named after those.
It's the one that broke with Durling.
Yeah, exactly.
With the wife of Oscar Lafontaine.
Correct. That there may actually be that sort of horseshoe left-right connection with AfD there. So I'm not enough of a Germanist to say what this looks like, but it certainly, again, is going to be an election that Russians care deeply about. All of the conditions are there for a pretty successful influence campaign. RT Deutsch faces the same restrictions that all RT outlets face in Europe prior to restrictions put in place by the EU. RT Deutsch on Facebook in 2021, when we did monitoring before the German federal elections, was the most popular German language media page on Facebook. Outperformed every major outlet you can think of. So they have built an audience, and they largely built that audience around anger towards COVID restrictions. It wasn't pro-Russian content that sort of brought them into the fold. So they've now kind of built some networks there around kind of the anti-establishment, anti-German censorship world that will give them pathways if they wanted to run an influence campaign, even though they're overt outlet. It's tough to view it, frankly, in Germany at this point. But again, there's many different ways you can bypass that. The Canadian election, I know less about the sort of dynamics there, other than clearly there you're looking at Chinese PRC influence being substantial as well. And again, we always focus on the presidential election, less focused on down ballot races, where it's frankly easier to run an influence campaign because people aren't paying attention. There's no real resources in the monitoring space. And it's easier to change people's minds. I mean, people have pretty hardened views about the top tickets. Not so much if you're talking about a congressional, I mean, congressional is not the right term for Canada, but a down ticket race somewhere, some sort of ballot measure where far easier to flip people's perceptions.
Yeah, both Canada and Australia down ballot issues with China.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from somebody observing online, Gabby.
Yeah, sorry, I'm representing So our question is, do the panelists see any major domestic issues in the United States becoming highlights / topics of prospective international disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think all of our foreign adversaries had to play ready for if this was another contested election. So the election denialism space is still ripe, and we're starting to see a little bit of that drift over to the left. There is now a strand of the left online who is questioning the legitimacy of this election. Very different from what we saw on the right in 2020 because it's not being amplified by mainstream media. the candidates, that's important, are not amplifying it. But the well has been poisoned enough that now the right wins an election, the left starts doubting it. So that's not great going forward. So that's an opening. I do think it really is that the censorship, political correctness, all these issues again that are, it's just sort of insane that Iran or Russia would have a voice there, but they do, especially in the covert space. That I think is in campus protests, things like that. There are a lot of openings there for a disinformation campaign to latch onto. I mean, everything Russia does is parasitic. They find whatever is out there that is the most divisive, and they find an angle into it. And they're very good at that. I give them credit for that. If you look at the messaging, it's far sharper than what we see from the PRC in particular. PRC sort of understands broadly the music they should be playing, but they definitely don't hit the right notes. Russia hits the right notes, I mean, to get us well. So right now it's this sort of wokeism, censorship. 6 months, there might be another NFL protest, and that will be what they'll latch onto. It's ever shifting.
And I think it did. I mean, you're already seeing it with the decision yesterday on Ukraine, allowing Ukraine to head inside Russia, that, this is playing out in a very, I mean, not just anti-Biden, but anti-military industrial complex message. So that's one. I don't know. I think maybe perhaps the mass deportations, these will be read by the outside. I mean, I don't know if the reporting yesterday in NBC is they will start with illegal immigrants from China before moving to other communities. So it would be interesting how China would read that, how it would report on it. And what I don't know, as an outsider, I mean, obviously now American, but looking at this, the level of polarization is frightening in the United States. You can't have a debate on anything. I mean, not just Middle East wars, just on simple matters like inflation, or what caused it, or how could it get better. So this degree of polarization is just perfect atmosphere for the outside. One would hope with a Trump win that a large section of the electorate is probably happier, feeling better, feeling more represented after having marginalized under and back by the woke and everything, that maybe they feel they're more represented by this, and as you're saying, an opportunity to bring them more into a logical debate about set of issues.
I mean, I think you're right with that assessment. Like Russia, from a policy point of view, probably preferred a Trump administration. Not probably, they preferred a Trump administration. The IC was pretty consistent that the narratives they were seeing online from Russian actors were sort of pushing a Trump presidency. I think they actually had a greater opportunity, if you looked at their goal of really creating chaos, potentially political violence, if Harris would have won. The conditions were better there if they wanted to throw a match that would really light us on fire if Harris had won this election, especially if it were very, very close and we were again fighting over 300 votes in a county in Wisconsin. So I do think we are, just from a risk perspective, in terms of a foreign influence campaign being something that could sort of push us over an edge, the risk is slightly reduced from where I thought it might be right now.
Secretaries of State like to say that Secretaries of State of the 50 U.S. states like to say that the best solution is a landslide.
Yeah.
You've been patient.
Yes, thank you. I'm Luis Montello. I am president of the Media for Democracy. I'm also a board member of the International Broadcast Advisory provide oversight. You say, yeah. So Joyce, I appreciate your comment on the state of social media. But my question is more related to the state of independent media globally and what role it plays with what's going on. We have polarization all over, because of all the digital disruptions. Do you think lack of trust of the media around the globe have contributed to that? And if so, what role do you think maybe US states news organization can play to address this issue?
Well, that'll need another series, panel series.
Well, yeah,
So
I
maybe
know.
we,
For another panel.
we come back for that. I can talk about the Middle East. Yeah, I know the landscape, the media landscape pretty well, and yeah, more bad news. There is no independent media in the region. There just isn't. Even, I mean, you look at Al Jazeera, it's Qatari owned, Qatari government owned. You look at Al Arabiya, Saudi government owned. And these are the largest outlets. We at Al Monitor, we report Middle East, but we're nowhere as large and as influential as those. We try, and we have no ceiling in actually reporting on anything, but there is definitely it's a problem. It's been a problem for decades, and I don't know how you break through. So there were attempts to start a famous journalist, you may know him, I know of him now, Jamal Khashoggi. He had an idea to start an independent pan-Arab TV, and it would be based in Bahrain, in Manama. It lasted a week before it was taken off air. It's a very challenging landscape because of the censorship, because of government ownership, not just TVs, but also, audiovisual. Does this create an opportunity for the US? Of course. Is the US making part of it? No. I mean, the Al Hurra television station, it had a bit brighter start than it's doing now, but there's no visibility. Even when they're based in Springfield, they're not covering Washington well. There's no scoops. The last scoops I remember, the exclusive that came from Al Hurra was when their cameraman happened to be standing near the Treasury Department, and a car came and was trying to go to near the White House and rammed through. And that was the footage. And that was when, Al Hurra was cited across, other channels. So it's a missed opportunity, because in such a landscape where you can't do investigative reporting about Saudi, and where you can't do investigative reporting about Qatar, because everybody is in sync that we can bash this country, we can bash that country, just don't go internally. There isn't a big opportunity for the US to drive independent journalism. It's just not doing it. So
Spending 160 hour break.
I was just briefly going to say, another region to look at is Latin America. If we're looking outside of the US, where Russian state media, RT and Espanol, is their best performing outlet by far, 2-1 over its English outlet. If you look at metrics across platforms, RT and Espanol outperforms Voz de America by 10-1, if not more. If you look at readership engagement across platforms, so we're getting smoked there. That is an area where I think you can find some support from the Trump administration that something needs to happen because of migration issues and everything else. We've gotten inquiries from the right for years about whether or not there was foreign malign influence helping to drive migration patterns, especially because you see the caravans coming. We've never found evidence of that, but I do think that's an area where you can find a little bit of receptivity with this administration. I don't think the answer is put more money into Voz de America. I think it's time for some creative thinking. And, the way Russia has built up their audience, they spend a lot of money attracting good talent there. The last I saw, our Spanish language broadcasting budget was like 11 million a year, which I don't know what RT and Espanol's budget is, but it's not that. It's more. And so I think we just need a little bit more creative thinking as opposed to going back to 1960s models.
Thank you. I think we have one more question.
Please have- I feel bad.
Ben Whitman is asking.
Well, this shouldn't be the last one, but thank you for your little bits of optimism about 2% of what you said. It hasn't worked. We're very depressed. And by the way, just a reference, Tom Kent, the previous director of RFERL, his book Striking Back does give some practical indications of how disinformation can be countered. Just throwing that out. Joyce, you promised to give us only bad news, but you did start with the Arab Spring in 2011. Did you believe in it at that time? Could it have worked? And could it ever happen again?
It's very easy question. I can see. I mean, of course, as a, Arab woman, liberal, we were super excited. I can tell you where I was when the Tunisia uprising started, when they toppled Ben Ali. I remember that moment. I was at, of course, Chipotle at the and DuPont Circle. I think they moved it now, but you do remember these vivid moments of, this is, I mean, my generation was there, but also the younger generation is out and pushing for change. So we had very high hopes. Could it have worked? Looking back at all the elements and the failures and how it went through, it depends on the country. Syria, I think a civil war could have been avoided. It didn't have to morph into that. It was clear from the beginning that a minority regime will fight to the end. And it would not give an inch unless you opt them into the political process. So going right in and calling for Assad to step down, I think that was a little bit of a stretch. In Egypt, the US could have pushed harder to sort of protect the democratic process after the fall of Mubarak. But then again, you've had Gulf countries, same with the media, what's being done, come in and orchestrate a coup that brought Sisi to office. Even then, the US could have at least called it a coup. We didn't. It's just, okay, it's some arrangement. Well, it's somebody new in power. Okay, let's just look it over and just keep continuing with the billions of aid to Egypt. So looking back, I don't know if other than Tunisia, there would have been hope. Yemen is in a state of war. Same Syria. It doesn't mean that change cannot happen in the Middle East. It's just we have maybe to start bottom up instead of revolution. Just start building institutions, reforms, bringing in different sectors to government, bringing in more women voices, more youth, and start there and see where things go. I think the Arab Spring models, what happened Gaza to 2007, it's hard not to see it, but complete failure 10 years after.
Peter, you last question.
Peter Adam, I'm just a businessman. I want to ask our panelists. All right, let me preface this by saying, before the election, there was fear that there'd be chaos, that there'd be accusations of voter fraud, that there'd be court cases, that it would go on for days, if not weeks, and that didn't happen. If you were the minister of disinformation in Russia or Iran or PRC, and you had to justify, like an after action report, you had to justify your budget, and you had to tell, the supreme leader that the money that you spend on our disinformation campaign is well spent. Would you try? I mean, was what they did a failure? I mean, what would you say? The money's well spent, double our budget next year? No, I mean, what would you say?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say it's. I think this scenario played out differently than anybody thought. And so I do think the play of Russia for sure, but probably the others, was a tight election where we'd be having this fight. So I think you go and just say, like, the outcome was such that we couldn't really roll out what we'd intended to do. It's an interesting question broadly of the sort of key performance indicators for
Right.
influence agents. I think at some level, we focus as a community sometimes on things that aren't all that important in terms of countering. And I'm sure they're doing some things that aren't all that important because they just get some metrics, they get views and things like that. So how they measure success is an interesting philosophical question. Again, the Russians, I think, are pretty happy with the outcome. And so I'm sure somebody is taking credit for swinging margins towards Trump. I don't think they should, but I'm sure somebody is because, you know, that's how it works in business, right? Somebody takes credit for. I don't know how the Iranians sort of feel about this and how, you know, their effort to damage the Trump campaign through the hack and leak did not work. So they may be having a trickier conversation with their bosses. But I don't think anyone will look at this outcome as a failure for them.
Yeah, I'm not sure the hierarchy and policy reviews in Iran happen in traditional ways that we know in the West. I mean, they perhaps overplayed their hand with also the DOJ unsealing the plot on Iranian plot to assassinate Trump. So I don't see that necessarily was the smartest plot on their part, but again, I mean, their whole the existence of this Iranian government, of the regime, of everything is built on animosity to the West and to the United States. So this is just another feather in their hat, so to speak, as far as how would they adjust after they're adjusting. I mean, not that I still don't understand how we can, I don't know how we're dealing with it or reporting it. Elon Musk is not an official. So when he goes and meets with the Iranian ambassador of the United Nations, an hour-long meeting that happened last week, we don't know how to report it. He's close confidant of President-elect Donald Trump. So it's honestly, it's all new and it's all strange, surreal, but interesting dynamic that we want to wait and see where it takes. But Iran has adjusted to worse times and for itself and on the global stage. They've worked with Reagan and public and non-public ways. They've worked the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war to their favor, and we'll see how they adapt to this.
Or just say as a final point, actually, it's not longer, but I'm hoping our friends in Moscow and Tehran are not watching. But if I were advising them,
Direct feedback.
I don't think it was a failure to focus on election integrity, election denialism, and I don't think that's gone away. So I would say, again, but if they back pocket it for 2 years, for 4 years, all of the conditions are still there. This hasn't died out just because Trump won. And one of the more sort of insane things we've seen in the info space is in some cases the same bits of bad data have been used by the left and the right to make election denialism arguments. But from the left saying that, so the data I'm talking about was right after the election, looking at vote totals for Harris compared to Biden in 2020. At that point, she'd gotten something like 20 million less votes. Of course, now they've actually counted the votes so that it's closer. But the left was saying this doesn't make any sense. How could, with all these conditions, like where do these votes go? And the right was saying, we told you so. They don't make sense. 2020 was rigged. All these votes disappeared. And so now you've got both sides who are kind of conditioned to have a skeptical view of election results. And so my fear is that 2 years, 4 years, we've now been primed and it could come back.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you. What's coming next?
Well, Larry, are you
Yeah.
bringing us up to speed? But just before we get to that, I would like to apologize to Al Monitor for mispronouncing the
It
publication
happens all the
earlier
time.
on in the day.
Okay, my name is Larry Woolens. I'm the vice president of CA. And then first of all, let's thank our two speakers for an absolutely fascinating discussion, both of what's going on around the world and how it plays back into what's happening in Europe and vice versa. Joyce, you used the words strange, surreal, and interesting. And if you look at 2025, I think we have all of that work, which perhaps for us as individuals isn't going to be a great thing. But the bright side is for PDCA, it means we have a lot of great material for programs in 2025. So watch our program or updates. If you're not a member, we really need you as a member to join us and help us be able to do the things that we're going to need to do coming up over the next year. So please join us and support us. And for December, we have a program with Ambassador Jean Main, our Deputy Permanent Representative in UNESCO on the 16th of December. Please join that one. And we have a end of the year get together, a holiday party. Maybe not supposed to celebrate, but to talk about. So we working on coming up this on December 3rd. So if you're a member, please sign up for that. If you're not a member, join and sign up for that. And last of all, thanks so much for possible things. The words, all of us do, and again. So thank you.